I'm David Bank, and I'm the editor and CEO of ImpactAlpha. And we have a 5-day-a-week morning newsletter covering impact investing that some of you might read. If you don't, you can have we have a special discount subscription code. I have to get that in, or my team will skin me. So go to subscribe and use Aspen50, and you'll get half off. We've given ourselves kind of this ridiculously audacious mandate of covering impact investing all the way from the smallest seed stage investments up to the biggest institutional investors across asset classes, stages, sectors, geographies. And so, needless to say, the people in this room have been immensely helpful in helping us navigate that, and not only as sources and contributors, but really as just teachers and mentors. And I was thinking all day today that these were people that actually learned from and have made us able to do that crazy thing that we try every day. When we started, we said we were going to cover impact investing as if it were a real beat, and in the expectation that it would become one, and it indeed has become one, as we've all heard today. Now the audience has expanded, and we're trying to get all over this bigger beat of new capitalism, or capitalism 2.0, or reimagined capitalism, or reinvented capitalism. It's kind of everywhere, isn't it? And so we're delighted to be here, and thank you to Aspen and Prudential for having us. We are all very lucky to have the panelists that we have here today as teachers and mentors for all of us. One of our operating assumptions had been that impact investing and impact practitioners have been living and developing this kind of new capitalism for decades. Kathy Clark talked about impact investing as kind of the R&D lab for this new capitalism. So we were charged with being the how panel. You heard the moral case earlier, you just heard the financial case. This is about the products, the practices, the performance. And the rest of the world wants to know what you've learned. So I'm going to ask each of you to share one big idea or key insight from your work that will animate this new capitalism. So the question is, what do early impact investors know that the broader financial markets need to know? So let's start, Tracy, with you. Tracy Palandjian is the CEO of Social Finance, and I'll let you explain more, but just start with the big idea.
Well, thanks so much, David. And by the way, ImpactAlpha is a great publication, online publication. Great to be with everyone, and thanks again to the Aspen Institute and Prudential. What an incredible milestone. And the animating thing that David wanted each of us to talk about, for us at Social Finance as a 10-year-old impact investing firm, is the intense focus on outcomes, on results. And the way we think about that is to rethink and reallocate risk in service of that set of outcomes. You may have heard about our work around social impact bonds, and what I'm hoping to talk about today in the context of Capitalism 2.0 is thinking about how we achieve better outcomes in economic mobility in this rapidly changing future of work, shifting structures of our global economy, which has left a lot of people behind, what Wes and Dan and others have talked about this earlier this afternoon, and how we think about investing and funding human capital in the face of these massive changes. And very quickly, David, what has worked well in the 20th century is no longer working well. We all know that around the turn of the 20th century, massive expansion of public high school education has enabled a generation of broad-based economic growth and prosperity, and then the second half of the 20th century, basically going to college is a ticket to the middle class, a slingshot to economic mobility. And right now, we're no longer seeing that to be the case. Look at some facts, right? Like the Great Divergence, income inequality, the worst since the Great Depression. At the same time, we also have this unprecedented fast-growing economy, 50-year low in unemployment rate. In fact, an economist told me recently that we have never seen this in recorded history, that over the last 2 years, the number of unfilled job openings has consistently exceeded the number of unemployed. And there are massive number of factors. But the current system, or rather the 20th century system, places all the risk on the individual. So if you're a young person and you want to go get a good job via getting a college, you take on debt, accepting the full risk that you may end up with no degree and no employable skills, right? And wrestle with decades of debt going forward. Or if you're a working adult, you might have to put a pause on your paying job to try to get a credential, to get upskill, hoping to get up that economic ladder, but it may not pan out. And what we're trying to do, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it, is how do you reallocate risk so that the individuals, especially low-income people, who do not have the capacity to bear that risk, especially in a more and more uncertain world, and how do we reallocate that risk across the public sector, for business, for employers, and importantly, for impact investors to make it work better for everyone.
So the reallocation of risk, you might have something to say about risk, Ellis. Ellis Carr is the CEO, President CEO of Capital Impact Partners. I was joking this morning with him that every time you use the acronym CDFI in print, you have to then spell it out because you don't want to assume people know it. So that says Community Development Financial Institution, which takes up a lot of space.
As soon as you say that, they wake back up after you finish saying that.
But you know something about maybe mispriced risk or misperceived risk. But tell us how Capital Impact Partners is dealing with that.
Sure. So Capital Impact Partners, again, is a national nonprofit community development financial institution. And effectively what that means is we're a mission-driven financial intermediary. So we deal with capital and the allocation of capital. And I think for us, we've been working at the heart of this work, and others like us, for nearly 40 years, right? So there is a certain level of understanding that we have of the communities, and oftentimes we find ourselves really at the nexus of both community and quote-unquote the efficiency, as I say, of the capital markets. And so oftentimes we see that there is misplaced risk, and there's additional risk premium put on things that are basically unknown, and typically that relates to disinvested communities. And we've been working at the nexus of this work for some time. I think for us, we are really thinking about how to kind of disrupt and redefine how capital flows in disinvested communities across the country. Really thinking about it from a few different frames. First and foremost, recognizing that people in communities are most proximate to not only the challenges, but also solutions, but they don't get paid for that, right? You think about the traditional capital markets equity analysts and those who are proximate to and understand certain sectors, there's a value that is placed on that. There's no value placed on people and communities, and we need to restore that. Secondarily, I think we need to think about, again, how community development financial institutions have been working at this work for about 40 years, but we've been really nipping at the edges of the traditional capital markets. And we need to think about how we put ourselves in the middle of the capital markets with structures and products so that we can then begin to influence and then change the way capital is assessed, risk is assessed, and capital can flow into communities.
So Debra Schwartz, Managing Director at the MacArthur Foundation. This all I know is very familiar to you because you've been one of my great teachers on sort of capital gaps and how to bridge them. So tell us a little bit about what you've learned in the context of your work at MacArthur.
Well, you just shared my insight, David. My insight after looking
That's
back.
What we do is we take the best ideas and we push them out.
So just read it in ImpactAlpha, you'll see. Let me add my thanks to our wonderful hosts from the Aspen Institute and Prudential. Prudential has been such an amazing colleague over the years to us in our impact investing work and in field building, and this is just really a fantastic gathering, so thank you. I do think that as we take stock of our own experience at the MacArthur Foundation over the last 40 years or so of impact investing, working with CDFIs, working with innovators in the social sector, our big takeaway is capital gaps are real. The market cannot actually solve every single thing. If that were true, we wouldn't have extreme poverty, we wouldn't have the inequality that we have, we wouldn't have the social problems and challenges that we face, whether that's in education or health or economic development. What we know, fortunately, is that market rate capital, profit maximizing capital, can play a fantastic role, can play a huge role. And Audrey can speak to some of the ways that they're helping harness that power. So we are not saying it's an either or kind of situation. It's a both and. We've got to have market rate capital that is increasingly impact oriented. But we also need what we call and others call catalytic capital to help pave the way, and whether that means investing in that early stage manager led by a person of color that's not proven out yet, to let them get to the place where they have the track record and the scale to bring in the commercial capital, or whether that's providing a low-cost long-term loan that's actually pretty low risk and high impact to a CDFI. We need catalytic capital in all its forms, whether it's an all-catalytic approach or a blended capital, stack that is directly de-risking and leveraging. We need that too. We can't solve the problems that we face in the world today on the basis of an impact investing model that doesn't embrace the full spectrum of capital. And that's the good news, right? There is a spectrum of capital. It ranges from purely profit-seeking capital that doesn't care about impact one way or the other, all the way onto the other end with philanthropy, which is an incredibly powerful tool as well, where it cares about impact and doesn't need a financial return. And then there is everything that's in between. And I think our big challenge ahead of us is to figure out how more people can understand how to harness those different pieces of the capital spectrum. Everybody doesn't need to do everything, but we need to appreciate each other and have a vision of an impact investing market that brings all the tools to bear. And what I especially love about it is it's all about collaboration at the end of the day. That built into that model of saying, how can I use these different kinds of capital sequentially or collectively? It's all about figuring out how we leverage each other's strengths, each other's risk appetites, return requirements, and so forth.
Great. So we've heard risk and outcome orientation. We've heard revaluing community and proximity. We've heard catalytic capital and collaboration. Audrey, in our prep call, said she could play the role of somebody from the big world of big capital. So so Audrey is the Chief Sustainability Officer and the Chief Marketing Officer of Morgan Stanley. I always like to say she's also a former Wall Street Journal reporter, as am I, so we have always had that in common. And Audrey, what have you learned in your I don't know exactly how many years, but of working on the sustainability side at a place like Morgan Stanley?
Yeah, so, thanks, David. We started actually working on sustainable investing 11 years ago. So if you think back to 2009, when there was kind of a lot going on in the financial services industry during the financial crisis, and starting kind of a new focus on sustainable investing was not the most intuitive thing, and certainly not what most people were demanding that we do. And I think that one of the things that for us was really important was that we really felt like it was important to recognize that sustainability, impact, sustainable finance, that it wasn't some sort of sideshow, right? It wasn't something that we were doing as part of our CSR efforts or part of our foundation or part of our, kind of sort of off to the lovely boutique side. We were actually saying, our theory of change was that thinking about environmental issues, thinking about community development issues was actually core to good business. And the challenge we really gave ourselves was, how can we prove out the case that you can harness the power of capital markets to actually help protect the environment and strengthen communities. We spent a lot of time working with wonderful partners. I've been saying this is sort of like old home week for us, but it's a wonderful reunion. And we have each of us have done various projects and initiatives together. And I think where we spend a lot of time thinking is where would be the biggest differential impact that a large capital markets player like Morgan Stanley could play. And that while we loved being able to be a part of some catalytic transactions that had more blended return goals, that where we could bring the biggest contribution was how do we get the whole rest of the capital markets to be able to do it. And so how can we find that area in the Venn diagram where profit maximizing capital could really align with impact, and how could we prove out the case that you actually can do both? So I would say in those first, the first number of years, and frankly still today, I spent a lot of my life actually just, researching and then sort of proselytizing around the fact that if you do the work and if you look at the numbers, you see that thinking about sustainability actually is good business, right? And that's part of how when we, we could go into the studies and whatnot, but I'll just, the real quick, I'll give you the quickest data point is most recently we did a study of 15 years of performance, 11,000 mutual funds comparing sustainable strategies to traditional strategies, and we found that if you put the return curves on top of each other, they're basically indistinguishable. So there was no discount to returns for thinking about sustainability as a part of your investment strategy. Where you did see a difference, though, was actually in the volatility, that there was bigger downside volatility to the traditional strategies. So I've never yet met an investor who says, I don't want an investment that has the same return with less downside volatility. And as a result of that is how we've been able to do things like we, back in 2012, we actually started a product platform for our investors who, again, were just looking for profits and, and not able in many cases to think about concessionary rates of return or whatnot. And we said at the time, this is back in 2012, that we were going to have $10 billion worth of assets in those. And we got a lot of sort of like, did she say B or did you say M, right? Because impact investing is usually with M. And, we said 10 billion. We actually, within 5 years, we actually got, now we're over 30 billion. As I know you were about to say, that's a drop in the bucket of what we could get to eventually. And so that's why there's great potential. But I think that the biggest lesson for us is that something that I think everyone in this room sort of intuitively has always sort of hoped and known, but we've needed the data to prove it to capital markets investors, that if you take all of your best rigorous investment tools to think about investment, why wouldn't you also want the additional data that you get about both risks and opportunities if you think about environmental consequences, societal consequences, governance issues, and that all of those put together really is what we think about as truly sustainable business, sustainable both in terms of economic returns as well as actually in the impact.
We can get into later perhaps this notion, sometimes people think, impact investors are being asked to take uncompensated risks, but it sounds like you're saying that the non-impact investors are actually taking the uncompensated risks on the downside.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, one of the most traditional responses that we often get from traditional investors is to say, I don't want you to constrain my universe of possible investable choices by putting all these additional environmental and, social stuff that's clouding my rigorous investment view. And I just say, look, if I told you that there is one portfolio that performs the way it performs, then there's another one that's the same and has a mystery element X added into it, and it kept returns and it decreased volatility, do you not want that one? And that really is just the additional insights from that. So we're seeing that really it's an important piece of actually evaluation and understanding not only long-term returns, which people often say, sure, but I'm interested in short-term, it actually impacts short-term results as well.
So I want to honor our pledge, our mandate to get into some examples and products. And I know, Audrey, let's just go maybe back the other way. Because you guys have put a lot of work into actually structuring products that you can offer, and you gave me a good example, and I don't want to, Debra accused me of stealing her punchline here, so I want to let you offer your own example. But
sure. Well, I'll give two quick ones. One is more just sort of access to the products, and then one is a specific initiative that we focused on. If you think back 11 years ago when sort of all the impact investing conversation was first starting, a lot of times when people heard impact investing, their minds kind of intuitively thought of probably a pretty interesting, charismatic, probably private equity opportunity or some other kind of interesting concessionary rate. And you had to either be a mission-driven institution or philanthropy or an extremely high net worth individual to think about one of these things. We've been able over the years to be able to take it from something where you had to invest millions in it to, a number of years ago we did sort of only $400,000, $600,000 to get diversified portfolios looking at it. And more recently we've got it down to $10,000 and actually now $5,000 minimum investment where a traditional investor can actually align their investments with sustainability. The specific initiative, though, that we're really excited about right now that I've been spending a lot of my time on, and I think it's a great example of where you can take mission alignment, risk, and opportunity, and it becomes a really compelling investment thesis, is we've been focusing actually on plastic waste reduction. Last year, we as a firm actually made a pledge that Morgan Stanley is going to facilitate the prevention, reduction, and removal of 50 million tons of plastic waste from rivers, oceans, and landfills by 2030. And for us, it's something that we care an awful lot about, but it's also something that is really not just an environmental issue, it's an economic issue. Just to give you one of the many data points I could give you, every single year in single-use plastic packaging alone, we take about $100 billion worth of economic value and throw it away, usually after about an average of 12 minutes of use, and then it takes 20 years or more to disintegrate into microparticles that end up back in your water and your food and your salt. So that's a sort of economic travesty, if nothing else. Where I think it comes to business is, of course, philanthropy has a huge role to play here. Of course, governments can have a huge role to play here. And of course, consumer behavior has a huge role to play. But we need to facilitate a massive flow of capital to figure out how we actually re-engineer the entire economy, from how plastic is formulated in the lab, how it's put into products, how it comes into your home, how it's disposed of and recycled, and hopefully not ending up in your food and water supply. And to just give you an example of two products, the week that we announced it, we did sort of an initial proof of concept bond, $10 million with the World Bank to help focus on marine health. Fast forward 6 months later, we're able to do a $1 billion green bond with Pepsi, where the majority of the proceeds were focused on reducing the virgin plastic in their beverage chain. And here's the financial kicker for the investors in the room. What was interesting was that this bond was so sought after because there was such a demand of investors wanting to have, high-grade paper, traditional debt that they understood how to risk rate and price from an issuer that they understood, and also aligned with their values, that it was highly oversubscribed, and it actually ended up saving Pepsi money to be issuing it as a values-aligned, plastic waste reduction-aligned, green-aligned bond, rather than just putting out regular paper in the market. So again, to your point, I think we're starting to see that there can be a real alignment of financial kind of dollars and cents, as well as impact.
We call those examples examples of
New capitalism?
ImpactAlpha was what I was looking for.
I hear there's an offer if you put Aspen on your
So self-serving, David.
Jeez. You gotta tee up those jokes better next time, David.
I didn't prep that one, obviously. Debra, you at MacArthur, I know, is part of something called the Catalytic Capital Consortium, which is trying to put a wrapper, in some sense, around this whole notion that you've been discussing. So what's an example of a catalytic investment that makes the case?
Great, thank you, David. Yeah, so we launched an initiative last spring. Omidyar Network and the Rockefeller Foundation are our strategic partners, and there are many other investors and partners that we're excited to be working with to try to increase knowledge about catalytic capital, but also its use around the world. And part of why we're doing this is because we realize this is what we've been doing for 40 years. We just hadn't really thought about it as a practice. And what we realized, too, is that we need to help others because, as Audrey pointed out, it's not necessarily the easiest part of the impact investing spectrum to engage in, but it can be deeply meaningful and incredibly important. I'll just give you 3 quick examples, but I will also say that one thing we know is that examples of catalytic capital use abound. We invited proposals last spring from over 100 organizations around the globe. What it surfaced was over $2 billion of unmet need for catalytic capital, and that was $2 billion that could in turn leverage very significant sums of commercial investment if successful. And it spanned every sector imaginable, from smallholder farmers in Rwanda to innovators in the healthcare and the energy arena, in gender lens investing around women's empowerment, financial inclusion, helping refugees in their economic plight, so many different kinds of uses around the globe. So it's just 3 quick examples that I'll share from our own portfolio. One is from a portfolio focused on the Chicago region, and it's really an interesting contrast to the Pepsi example because they're both impact investment, but they're a world apart. So Pepsi is this big, well-heeled corporation with access to capital, doing something really wonderful and innovative in partnership with Morgan Stanley. We worked with a fledgling entrepreneur whose business is called Autonomy Works, and he had created a for-profit business, this entrepreneur, to provide meaningful employment and sustainable employment for young adults with autism, because his son is autistic. And one of the things was that when they aged out of school, they don't really have a place to go, and developmentally disabled sheltered workshops were not necessarily an appropriate solution. And in fact, he's built a business around the fact that his workforce, which is over 80% on the autism spectrum, that they are really excellent at certain kinds of tasks. And so they provide kind of back-end support and analytics for digital marketing campaigns. He could not get a loan from a bank for lots of reasons. Starting out, no collateral, a very unusual business model, wasn't really a business that was designed to say, let me do the thing that is absolutely profit maximizing. This business was set up to try to create these employment opportunities. And so we provided a loan using a structure called a revenue-based financing model, which is increasingly in use. And it was because it was an equity-like investment, and it was playing the role that equity would play in that organization, but it had a self-liquidating mechanism, because this is not a business that's going to go to IPO and have that type of liquidity event for the investor. So that's one example of kind of using really suitable financing for the enterprise. And that's a capital gap because it's a small, early-stage, innovative business. Other examples, very quickly, Terra Silva, which you wrote about, David, last fall, is a new fund that we've created out of the catalytic capital work. Packard Foundation is our partner. They're looking to build, through a blended fund that we've created together, really a whole new asset class around investing in sustainable land use in and near tropical forests, and the idea is to build up a whole cadre of successful fund managers. So it needs catalytic capital today, but the vision is that tomorrow these managers will be able to stand on their track records and go it alone. And finally, I want to mention the Zero Gap program, which has been pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation through R&D grant making over a number of years. We co-invested with Rockefeller through a very innovative structure, and they are now managing a pool of funds and deploying it into businesses like SixUp, which is using an alternative credit scoring model to bring financing to college students that have been underserved, in investments in organizations like Craft, which is really working around the climate adaptation challenge, and many others. So we have some of these on our website, some are on the Rockefeller website, and we'll be happy to share any more examples that people are interested in.
Great. Tracy, you've always impressed me because of the sophistication and detailed work that goes into structuring the kinds of deals you put together, from social impact bonds and now the sort of evolution of that. So tell us about the newest evolution.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful to follow Debra because it is catalytic capital that gave birth to the possibility of new vehicles like social impact bond and what I'd love to talk a little bit about today, the career impact bond, which is a new strategy. At social finance, we kind of, maybe we punish ourselves, but we invent these highly structured products with impact at the center of it. So the social impact bond is about using private capital to make more effective use of public dollars, how government spends social spending, how they spend their social program dollars. And the career impact bond is got a different twist. So instead of enabling government to pay for success, we're enabling low-income populations to finance their own success in the new economy. And over the years, we've actually touched, Debra, it's great that you talked about all the capital along the spectrum, and we've been lucky to have experienced almost everything from R&D grant capital, and many thanks to the team at Prudential Foundation. It was a grant from Proofnet Foundation that enabled the birth of the career impact bond. And then also over the years, we deployed catalytic capital in service of the social impact bonds because they are untested with no track record, uncompensated risk. And over time, we've been able to blend different structures to access the more commercial nature of it. And Prudential actually was in one of the social impact bond deals. And they just have been amazing at skillfully deploying capital along the spectrum. So how does a career impact bond work? Right now, we are actually working with the Pru team. We got introduced to a coding boot camp a couple of years ago by the name of General Assembly. First of all, I had never heard of a coding boot camp 2 years ago, because they weren't really a thing until maybe 7 or 8 years ago, because why? Our higher ed system is not responding to what employers need. Employers want digital literacy, and they are not giving these kind of worker-ready graduates. So a whole class of coding boot camps have flourished, and you've heard of many of them in the marketplace, and General Assembly is one of them. They have an amazing track record at job placement and sustained wages of folks who graduate going on a pathway of economic well-being. Yet their program is pretty expensive. It's not Pell eligible because it's not a Title IV institution. So it's $15,000, 3 months full-time. If you're low income and you have to pay rent and childcare and transportation, you can't take time off from work to take on this journey. Not least, they don't have the credit score or the savings to do this. So what we're developing with the PRU team and General Assembly is to devise an income share agreement model to enable low-income folks to access this high-quality training at no upfront cost to them and no risk to them. So the deal is that if you hit the eligibility criteria, which is defined as you've been in the criminal justice system, or you've been on public assistance, or you've been on EITC, then you can go into this program at no cost to you. And then if you're successful at getting a job that pays over a significant income threshold, then you pay a percentage of your gross wages over a fixed period of time with, importantly, a cap on the overall amount that you can pay. A lot of consumer safeguards. The ISA is the term of art, income share agreement, but because of the way we're thinking about it, which is the target population focus, which is, it's not just a consumer finance tool, you get a loan, you get an ISA, but rather, you can only access this if you qualify for it. And we're not just financing tuition, but importantly, the wraparound support services, which prevent many of these people from persisting and graduating. And finally, importantly, tapping catalytic capital to enable all of this to happen. So we're doing it in the coding world. We're also really exciting, working with Aspen and J&J, thinking about how the career impact bond structure could also address the labor shortages in nursing. It's actually quite timely to talk about this, but the WHO, well, they've had a busy season, but late last year declared that the year 2020 is going to be the year of the nurse and the midwife, because 2020 marks the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale, and professional nursing has really transformed patient care and delivered extraordinary health outcomes for large populations. But it's not easy to get up the nursing ladder. The average nurse graduates with $30,000 in debt, and of the 15 million healthcare job postings around the world, half of them are in nursing. So massive need, massive potential impact, and we're thinking about these innovative structures to enable that to happen.
Great. One of the undersung stories, I think, of recent years is how the CDFI world has moved into the more mainstream capital markets, and no better example of what you've done at Capital Impact Partners.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, I think, as a mission-driven financial intermediary responding to the needs of the community, we have to be creative and we have to be flexible. We need flexible and creative catalytic capital to be able to respond. And so oftentimes, the birth and the growth of the CDFI industry was really fueled by the Community Reinvestment Act. And as we've recognized that we need new flexible forms of capital, we created a fixed income product to go out to the capital markets. Specifically, we created a S&P rated impact investor note that we issue every month, which looks a lot like corporate debt. So for individuals and institutions. So for as little as $1,000, someone can go into their brokerage account and buy a capital impact note. And that note is supporting affordable housing. It is supporting the creation of quality health care and education in underserved communities and addressing food deserts across the country. And we found that that has been a really interesting and highly successful event because we can pay a market rate return because we're S&P rated that has signal to the capital markets what level of risk that capital impact is in this case, and we pay a rate in response to that. And what it does is it actually, the bigger part of this story, I think it's a success story, because we raised in probably just a little under 2 years over $150 million across a wide group of investors, both individuals and institutions, be it foundations, insurance companies, and socially motivated mutual funds. It's really been about the mindset shift and the conversation that we've had with individuals and institutions. So for example, they may call up and ask, so first of all, how do you make money, right? I didn't think you could do this work and actually make money, one. How do you think about education and what makes a good school? Why would you invest in a school versus another one? So we can talk to them about what a quality school is to us, and how do we think about restorative justice techniques within the school? And so that broker is not only working with a capital impact, but they're working with a wide variety of investors who they can take that education to and that lens into broader investments. So while we're a small little speck in the capital markets, we're beginning to really influence the purveyance of how people look at how they invest their money as well. The last thing I'll just mention too is just really the kind of the social activism of this, right? Having the ability to buy a note that aligns with your value with a little as investment as $1,000 is meaningful. So then it allows us all to have a voice to really be able to influence this new capitalism that we're talking about.
So I just want to tell folks to get your questions ready. I think we're going to have time for 2 questions, and we'll do it the same way as earlier, where we'll take the 2 questions and then we'll let the panel respond to both of them at once. But I just want to remind you, just sort of summarize what you've heard here. So corporate grade bonds that are funding affordable housing, health clinics, schools, income share agreements that are funding vocational education for low-income students and formerly incarcerated, revenue-based financing for a job creation plan for autistic adults, as well as the other fund and other kinds of things, and then corporate bonds for companies like Pepsi that are cleaning up plastic waste. So a huge variety of instruments and products that take a lot of brain power to put together, I know. However, and you sort of queued this up earlier, it's still a small fraction of the full capital market. So 30 billion out of, I think, something like 2 trillion at Morgan Stanley, and not to put too fine a point on it, $1 billion from Prudential out of, I think, 1.5 trillion in assets there. And so the question really is, what next? How to, as everybody says, get to scale, as we've been talking today, not just capital scale, but impact at scale. And this is, you don't need to go in order here, just jump in.
I'll just go really quickly. I think that we are, from a capital markets perspective and sort of mainstream finance perspective, we are definitely in that moment of a massive sea change, right? And I think if anyone's read any of the papers in the past couple of months, you've seen things like, BlackRock as the largest asset manager in the world with $7 trillion in assets, saying that they want all the companies to start thinking about sustainability disclosures. You've got State Street Advisors, third largest asset manager in the world, also saying that recently at Davos, was the year that a lot of CEOs came back and said, oh, that sustainability stuff was actually not in the side room for the breakouts after lunch or outside the perimeter, but actually on the main stage. Something new is happening here. And so I think we're actually seeing suddenly we're seeing lots and lots and lots of colleagues who have recently discovered that they have a long-standing commitment to sustainability, which is great. And so we're really excited about that. And for me, I think one of the most important things that we think about here is, so A, it's good news that the mainstream capital markets, mainstream investors, mainstream allocators of capital have woken up to the fact that for many, many reasons, in part investor demand, in part board demand, in part sort of social trends, and in part, mega trends like climate change and income inequality and things that we are seeing can really have material impact on the economy. For all these reasons, they are seeing reasons to align capital with impact. I think the biggest thing that keeps me up at night is making sure that as we bring scale to this, that we're able to also really keep high rigor and quality. And I think that's something where everyone here has an enormous piece to play, right? Because this is one of those things things where, the great thing about Venn diagrams is you have an alignment of interest. The really challenging thing is it means there's two ways that you can mess up. Right? So we as a movement can be in great peril a couple years from now if either one or both of the following things happen. A bunch of capital runs into sustainable investing saying, oh, I hear you can make just as much money and you can do good, and they happen to pick a couple of investments or funds or sectors or whatever that for reasons maybe completely unrelated to sustainability don't do well, and they say, see, we told you there was a reason that was, all those mission-driven investors and, people who've taken vows of poverty who do that kind of investing. We shouldn't have taken real capital there, right? And we want to avoid that. So we need to be really rigorous about if you are making representations about return expectations, that those are really rigorous and diligenced as much as any financial product. On the other hand, if we're kind of loosey-goosey with impact, and we're like, yeah, this is a ESG, sustainability, equality, something good, fund, we need to be really rigorous about what does that mean, right? Are you saying that this particular fund is going sector agnostic and just choosing, best in class in each particular sector, but not necessarily focusing on social impact, then that gives an investor understanding of what that is. But it's very different than choosing one of the projects that you're working that's highly intentional around impact for students or impact for communities. And we just need to be so rigorous with ourselves, because the last thing we want is for investors to think that they were investing in one thing, to either have that impact go very awry, or realize only after the fact that they got an impact which was not what they thought at all. So I think there's a huge imperative on us that this is a tidal wave of opportunity that we are looking at right now, and we got to manage it really carefully on both the financial rigor and the impact rigor side.
Great. Let's get the questions and then work your answer into the general answer, because we're sort of running out of time. Is that okay, Aspen folks? So are there questions?
There's one way in the back.
I can't really see anything. If somebody's in the back, yeah. It was a good one.
Particularly for Debra and the Catalytic Capital Fund, as you think about the restrictions around 501c3s and foundations that can sometimes make it challenging to work with organizations that are for-profit, not cash flow positive, when you think about private benefit or inurement laws, when you think about the role that family offices can play in dovetailing with the type of catalytic capital you're providing, what's your big ask for how someone like an Emerson or a CZI or any of the big, sophisticated, flexible, structured type family offices can play a role to amplify your work?
Thanks.
Is there one more? If there's not, we can just go, and I think nobody will complain. Okay, so let's just take that.
That's a fantastic question. I think one of the things that I'm really grateful for is that we have an amazing group of legal colleagues at the foundation. It is one of the real perks of being in a large private foundation, and I think they work incredibly well with us in trying to make sure that we can reach the kinds of organizations and intermediaries that need funds, and work our way through some of the regulatory challenges. But there is no doubt that family offices and other kinds of entities have flexibility that they can bring to the table, and that's super important. Our ask for the family office community, the foundation community, but also the institutional investor community, the peers of institutions like Prudential, is to take their cue from a Prudential, for example, and think about whether or not in their impact investing work there's a way to include a piece of that might be a little bit more risk-taking, flexible, patient, a little more willing to be kind of that early problem-solving piece that creates the model, builds the institution, and paves the way for the more commercial capital down the road, or that, like we did with our colleagues at Citi, for example, where we built, and Morgan Stanley and some other banks, where we've been able to do blended structures together. And I think the bottom line is we have this spectrum of capital, and our hope for the field is that there's an embrace of the idea of a spectrum, that we don't land up with an impact investing field that thinks that everything can be ultimately fit into the market rate risk-adjusted model, because we know that if we do that, we're going to be leaving a lot of impact and a lot of innovation and a lot of inclusion behind. We are not saying it is an either or, it's a both and And there was a fantastic series that our colleagues at Omidyar Network did last year called Beyond Trade-Offs. It features the Prudential model, but also 7 other family office and foundation and institutional models. And it's a great way for people to look at it and say there might be something there that's possible, that could be adapted or used. I would just say the one other thing, my one other closing thought was that we also have to remember, and I think we've heard this earlier today, it's not just about investing. And that might seem funny coming from the impact investing person, but it is also about the other pieces that are necessary for making change. That's technical assistance, research and development, research of other kinds, people and institutions like we heard from Kathy Clark, and she is part of a whole community of folks that are really doing such important research to support the growth of the impact investing field. Impact measurement and management, and we heard about IMP from Kathy, and we think that is an important piece of infrastructure. Community engagement, finally, is also something that's critical to our work to make the impact responsive and authentic. And most of those things that I just listed require grant support. They can't be done through investments, and our investing work is not going to be transformational if we don't think about that larger ecosystem.
I was just going to add to your wonderful list of elements and the building blocks of a thriving ecosystem. And one more thing that I want to channel from our lunch conversation is the importance of smart policy and an enabling legislative environment to actually do all these things. And I just want to call out, among others, the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, friends here, has been really thinking about how to create this enabling policy environment, which is huge.
Ellis, you actually get the last word.
It's always problematic. Just to add on to kind of Debra and Audrey's points, I think as we talked about today, there's been a continuum of capital that is needed. And as I started with this, right, it's all around kind of rethinking your role in it. And a lot of times we as organizations get really mired in replicating the things that we always have done in the past. But this is the time to really rethink that and really think about how you can add value within the continuum of capital role.
Well, great. I think you've gotten a taste of next generation finance, so join me in thanking the panel. Thank you all.